Welcome to Dreamstate Stories. These stories are here to transport you to a world just beyond reality, whether you're on the move or settling in somewhere quiet. Allow your imagination to play. Lean into the what if. Let yourself remember what it felt like to believe in things you couldn't quite explain. We're glad you're here. The tending. Every morning, without fail, the flowers open. It happens while you sleep, while the whole world sleeps. You close your eyes in darkness, and when you open them again, the garden has changed, quietly, as though it happened all by itself. Scientists have names for this. Botanists have explanations. Textbooks have diagrams with arrows and labels and words like nyctinasty and phototropism. But there are older stories passed down in whispers long before the textbooks were written. Stories about lights that drift through gardens after midnight, about tiny hands that work through the dark hours, tending to things we never see. Most people have forgotten these stories. Most people. There was a child who couldn't sleep. Her name was Ellie, and she was the kind of child who noticed things. She kept smooth stones in a jar on her shelf. She pressed flowers between the pages of heavy books. She had drawn a careful map of the backyard, marking every interesting spot in crayon. Long summer nights had a habit of stretching past the point where sleep felt possible. Too warm, too bright at the edges, too full of the feeling that something interesting might be happening just out of sight. So she watched. From her bedroom window, she watched the garden below, and the first thing she noticed was the lights. Fireflies, she knew, blink at random. Little sparks in the dark, each one doing its own thing in its own time. But these lights moved together. They drifted in slow spirals. They gathered in clusters near certain flowers and seemed to linger there as though considering them. And every morning, without fail, the flowers they had gathered over were open. She tried to tell the adults. She described the patterns, the clusters, the way the lights moved with what seemed like purpose. They listened the way adults sometimes listen to children, kindly, partially, already thinking of something else. Fireflies, they said. No, that's just how flowers work. You should be sleeping. Ellie looked down at her cereal and said nothing more about it. But the next afternoon, alone in the garden, she crouched beside the rose bush and looked very closely at the petals. There was something on them, barely visible in full daylight, a faint shimmer, like the residue of something that had been there and wasn't quite gone. She touched a petal gently. The shimmer flickered. She pulled her hand back, stared. That evening, she opened her notebook and wrote 2 words. It's real. She watched from her window for 10 nights in a row. She had 2 questions she couldn't answer from the window. So she decided to go outside and ask them in person. The garden at midnight was different from the garden in daylight. The air was cooler and still, and smelled of earth and something else, something faintly sweet that she couldn't quite name. The grass was wet under her bare feet, and the lights were everywhere, more than she had ever seen from above. Dozens of them drifting above the flower beds, spiraling slowly over the lawn, clustering and dispersing and clustering again. She stood very still and watched one drift close, close enough that she held her breath, before it veered away toward the roses. She followed the light to the rosebush. Up close, she could see it hovering just above a closed bud. She leaned in and she saw. The light was not a firefly. It was, impossibly, unmistakably, a tiny figure, no bigger than a thumb. Winged, but not like an insect's wings. These wings were layered like flower petals, translucent, catching the moonlight the way dew catches it. The figure was holding something, a tiny bundle like a pouch, and from it trailed a soft, golden glow. The fairy hovered beside the rosebud, reached into the pouch, took a tiny pinch of dust that glowed like captured starlight, and brushed it gently, gently across the folded petals. And the petals, just slightly, just barely, shivered, as if stirring in a dream. The fairy moved on to the next bud. Ellie stood completely still. She was afraid that if she moved, if she blinked, it would be gone, that she would be standing barefoot, alone in the garden, and the night would be ordinary again. But it didn't vanish. The fairy continued working, moving to the next bud and the next. And then Ellie looked up from the rosebush and realized the garden was full of them. They were everywhere. She had watched them from her window for 10 nights, and she had never seen, never come close to seeing what was actually happening down here. Dozens of fairies scattered across the garden, moving between the flowers with the ease of long practice. Some carried pouches of glowing dust, gold or pale blue, or a soft green that seemed to come from the moss itself. Some hovered close to buds and seemed to whisper to them, though from where Ellie stood, she could only see their tiny hands gesturing, their mouths moving without sound she could hear. Some moved in small groups, circling a single flower together, their wings beating in gentle unison. The whole garden shimmered softly from below, like a field of stars brought down to earth. She knelt beside a patch of clover. 3 fairies were working there. She could see the details now, the weave of their tiny garments, which seemed to be made of something like petals and silk. The way their dust pouches were tied with thread fine as spider silk. The careful, focused expressions on their faces. One fairy brushed dust across a clover blossom, and the blossom responded, leaning very slightly toward the fairy, the way a person leans toward warmth. Ellie's mouth opened. She didn't make a sound, but something in the air shifted. The nearest fairy turned and saw her. For one long, frozen moment, neither of them moved. A ripple moved through the garden. One by one, the fairies went still. One by one, they turned. There was no alarm, no scattering, but the quality of the silence changed. They had been discovered before, not in a very long time, not in what was, for them, several human lifetimes, but they remembered what it meant. They remembered the old stories from their own side of things, how long ago humans and fairies had known each other, and how slowly, gradually, humans had stopped believing in quiet things. And so the fairies had become very, very careful. Ellie, still on her knees in the clover, realized that all of them were watching her. Her face in that moment was not afraid. It was not excited in a grabbing, wanting way. It was something gentler than that. It was the face of someone who has just had the most important question of their life answered. One fairy moved. She drifted forward across the tops of the clover until she was hovering directly in front of Ellie's face. She studied her carefully, the way a creature studies something that might be dangerous or might be safe and has not yet decided which. Very slowly, Ellie opened her hand, palm up, an offering of space, an old human gesture that means, I'm not going to take anything, I'm just here. The fairy looked at the open hand, looked at Ellie's face. Something in her posture changed. The wariness didn't disappear, but it softened. She didn't land in the hand, but she drifted just slightly closer. Ellie never spoke to the fairy, nor learned the fairy's name. She wasn't sure they had names exactly, not the kind that could be said in human words. But she understood, somehow, in the way you understand things that have no language, that she had been seen and considered and found safe. The fairy turned back to her work. The others followed one by one. And Ellie stayed where she was, kneeling in the clover, watching. She came back the next night, and the night after that. She began to understand the work, not in the way you understand something you've been taught, but in the way you understand something you've witnessed many times with great attention. Different flowers needed different kinds of dust. Roses needed something dense and golden, a dust gathered from the longest rays of dusk, warm and heavy. Wildflowers needed something lighter, pale as moonlight, scattered loosely as a breath. The most delicate things, orchids, night-blooming jasmine, flowers Ellie had no name for, required dust gathered from starlight itself, carried in sealed pouches that were only opened for a moment so the light inside wouldn't scatter. Moonlight strengthened the dust. She noticed the fairies always paused, just briefly, when they crossed a patch of open ground where the moon fell directly, holding their pouches upward, just slightly, as though filling them without effort, the way you could hold an empty cup out in the rain. The whole meadow beyond the garden fence glowed softly on the nights when the moon was full. Hundreds of fairies moving through the wild flowers, buttercups, clover, chicory, like a slow, living constellation drifting an inch above the grass. The flowers knew them. That was the part that struck her the most. A blossom would lean very slightly toward an approaching fairy. Petals would seem to gently soften when the dust touched them. There was the smallest, most delicate bow as a fairy passed, so subtle you could convince yourself you hadn't seen it. She looked at flowers differently after that, and she learned one more thing later that changed the way she saw every closed blossom she ever encountered again. During the day, the fairies slept inside the flowers. A closed blossom was not just a closed blossom. It was a door. It was a room. Somewhere inside the tight, furled petals of a dahlia or a peony, something small was sleeping, resting for the long night's work ahead. She had walked past more than 1,000 closed flowers in her life and had never known what they held. She became deliberate about the garden in a way she hadn't been before. She paid attention to what was already there and what could be added to it. She spent her allowance at the garden center on plants she'd never heard of before, night-blooming plants, plants that smelled strongest after dark, plants that the books described as good for pollinators. She asked the old woman 2 doors down what grew well in this soil and listened carefully to the answer. She kept a new map, more careful than the crayon one, with every plant noted and dated. When she saw neighborhood kids idly flattening a patch of wildflowers, she didn't shout or make a fuss. She just waited quietly until they moved on, and then she crouched to check on what was damaged and tended to it. She never told anyone. Not because she thought they wouldn't believe her, though they probably wouldn't have, but because some things are not meant to be told. Some things are meant to be held quietly, carefully, the way you hold something fragile, or something borrowed, or something that trusted you. Years pass the way years do when you are paying attention to something that matters. The garden grew richer and stranger and more beautiful every season, full of things Ellie had brought home and planted with care. The neighbors would stop at the fence and remark on it, use words like thriving and extraordinary, and not quite be able to say what made it different from other gardens. The flowers here bloomed more fully. They seemed to turn more readily toward the light. They recovered from hard rains and early frosts better than the season should have allowed, as though someone was looking after them. She never stopped walking through the garden at night. She grew up, as children do. She learned many things. She forgot some things she had once known, but not this. Years later, she still moved through the garden after dark. Not every night, but often. On warm nights, on clear nights, on nights when something in her chest felt like a question that only the garden could answer. She still moved carefully, with the particular quiet gait of someone who knows the ground is alive with more than they can see. The lights were still there. She didn't look at them directly anymore. She had learned long ago that the work was not hers to watch too closely. Her part was more simple: to plant things and tend things and stay out of the way. Every morning, the flowers open. It happens while you sleep, while the whole world sleeps. You close your eyes in darkness, and when you open them again, the garden has changed, quietly. Scientists have explanations for this, and they are not wrong. But they are not the whole story. Thank you for being here. We hope this story carried you somewhere worth going. We'd love to know what you thought. Did the world unfold the way you imagined it? Or does your version of the story look a little different? Tell us in the comments, because we genuinely want to hear. And if Dreamstate Stories is something you'd like more of, subscribing and sharing means everything to a small channel. It's the simplest way to help these stories find the people who need them. Until next time, keep dreaming.